On a cold November morning in 1703, a crowd gathered in London's Charing Cross, one of the city's busiest intersections. They came not for a market, not for a festival, but to witness justice. Standing locked in a wooden device, his head and hands trapped between two boards elevated above the crowd, was Daniel Defoe, author, journalist, political pamphleteer, and future creator of Robinson Crusoe. His crime? Writing a satirical pamphlet that mocked religious hypocrisy. For the next 3 days, Defoe would stand in the pillory while London passed judgment, merchants on their way to shops, housewives heading to market, children running errands. All would see him there, displayed like merchandise, reduced from respected writer to public spectacle. The authorities expected humiliation, mockery, perhaps violence. They expected Defoe to be broken by shame. But something unexpected happened. The crowd that gathered didn't throw rotten vegetables or stones. They threw flowers. They drank toasts to his health. Someone distributed printed copies of his hymn to the pillory, a poem Defoe had written from prison, mocking the very punishment he was about to endure. The device designed to shame him instead transformed him into a hero of free speech. This paradox, the pillory as both instrument of social control and potential platform for resistance, reveals the complexity of medieval justice. For over 6 centuries, from the 13th century through the early 19th, the pillory stood in town squares across Europe and colonial America, serving purposes far more sophisticated than simple punishment. It was theatre, education, ritual, and warning. It was a machine for manufacturing shame in societies where reputation mattered more than almost anything else. This documentary examines the pillory's history, function, and meaning. We'll explore how a simple wooden device became central to medieval justice, why societies relied on public humiliation rather than private confinement, and what the pillory's eventual disappearance tells us about changing ideas of punishment itself. But to understand the pillory, we must first understand the world that created it, a world where justice operated in full view of the community it served. Medieval Europe in the 13th century faced a fundamental problem: how to maintain social order without the infrastructure of modern states. There were no police forces in the sense we understand them, no prisons designed for long-term confinement, no bureaucratic apparatus for tracking criminals or enforcing sentences across distances. According to legal historian John Hudson in The Formation of the English Common Law, published in 1996, medieval justice operated primarily through local communities policing themselves. The franc pledge system, documented in English legal records from the 10th century onward, required every man to belong to a tithing, a group of 10 households mutually responsible for each other's behavior. If one member committed a crime, the entire tithing paid the fine unless they produced the offender for judgment. This communal responsibility created powerful incentives for local social control. Your neighbor's crime became your financial burden. Your family's reputation depended on your behavior being beyond reproach. In this context, justice needed to be visible, not just to deter future crime, but to demonstrate to the entire community that order had been restored, that the transgressor had been identified, that accountability had been established. The pillory emerged from this need for visible justice. According to the Statute of the Pillory enacted under King Edward I in 1405, though the practice existed long before this formal codification, the device was to be maintained in every market town throughout England. The statute specified its construction: 2 upright posts supporting hinged wooden boards with 3 circular openings for the head and hands of the condemned. But the statute also specified something more important: placement. The pillory had to stand in the market square, near the church, at the center of communal life. It couldn't be hidden in some remote location. The entire point was visibility, making punishment impossible to miss or ignore. Medieval legal theory, preserved in texts like Bracton's De Legibus et Consuetudinibus Angliae, written around 1250, distinguished between crimes against individuals and crimes against the community. Theft wasn't merely taking someone's property. It was violating the trust that made communal life possible. Fraud wasn't just deceiving a customer. It was corrupting the commercial relationships that sustained the entire town. For these crimes against communal order, the punishment needed to be communal as well. The pillory provided the mechanism. It transformed individual transgression into collective ritual, with the entire community participating as witnesses, judges, and executors of social consequences. But what specific behaviors warranted the pillory? The answer reveals medieval priorities and anxieties in ways court records alone cannot. Court records from medieval England, particularly those preserved in the Old Bailey archives covering London's criminal cases from 1674 onward, reveal patterns in pillory sentences. The crimes weren't murder, rape, or serious violence. Those merited hanging or other forms of execution. The pillory was reserved for what we might call offences against commercial trust and public morality. Bakers who sold underweight loaves, brewers who watered down ale, butchers who sold tainted meat. These marketplace crimes appear repeatedly in pillory sentences throughout medieval records. The Assize of Bread and Ale, a set of regulations dating to 1266, in specified exact weights for loaves and prices for different qualities of bread. Violations weren't trivial. In a society where bread constituted the bulk of most people's diet, a baker who cheated on weight was literally stealing sustenance from the poor. A case from 1316, documented in London's letterbooks, preserved at the Guildhall Library, describes a baker named John de Stratford sentenced to the pillory for selling loaves 13 ounces short of the required weight. He stood for 1 hour while the deficient loaves hung around his neck, so the crowd could see exactly what he'd done wrong. The punishment wasn't arbitrary humiliation. It was educational theatre demonstrating the nature of his transgression. Fraud occupied a special category. According to Barbara Hannawalt in Crime and Conflict in English Communities, 1300 to 1348. Published in 1979, medieval markets operated largely on trust. Without standardized measures, without government inspectors, without modern consumer protection, buyers relied on sellers' honesty. Someone who sold fake jewelry as gold, who passed off mutton as venison, who claimed goods were locally made when they'd been imported. These fraudsters didn't just cheat individual customers. They undermined the trust that made commerce possible. The pillory for fraudsters often included the tools of their crime. Sellers of fake jewelry might have the counterfeit pieces hung around their necks. Dishonest dice makers might have loaded dice displayed above their heads. The visual pedagogy was explicit. This person, this crime, this consequence. Perjury, lying under oath in court, also merited the pillory. Medieval legal systems relied heavily on oath-taking and witness testimony. According to court records, perjurers would stand in the pillory with a paper attached to their chest listing their crime. Sometimes their ears would be nailed to the pillory board, though this practice became less common over time, as authorities recognized it as excessive cruelty. But perhaps the most revealing category of pillory crimes was what medieval law called common scolds, people, almost always women, accused of causing social discord through gossip, quarreling, or simply being outspoken. The legal logic reveals medieval anxieties about social harmony, and particularly about women who violated expectations of submissive silence. According to Sandy Bardsley in Venomous Tongues, Speech and Gender in Late Medieval England, published in 2006, and common scold was a legal category that allowed communities to punish women whose speech was deemed disruptive, even if they'd committed no crime in the modern sense. The punishment was often the scold's bridle, a metal cage with a tongue-depressing gag. But the pillory served similar purposes for both men and women whose words threatened communal peace. This gendered dimension of pillory punishment reveals that the device wasn't merely about justice in the abstract. It was about maintaining specific social hierarchies, enforcing commercial honesty, and preserving a particular vision of order where everyone knew their place and fulfilled their assigned role. But the pillory's effectiveness didn't come from the physical device itself. It came from what happened while the condemned stood locked in those wooden boards. What was it actually like to stand in the pillory? Historical accounts from those who endured it, rare but revealing, describe an experience that combined physical discomfort with profound psychological distress. The physical position itself was awkward, but not agonizing. The condemned stood upright, with head and hands protruding through the circular openings in the hinged boards. The boards were locked shut, making it impossible to withdraw. There was no sitting, no lying down, no changing position. For sentences of 1 to 3 hours, this was merely uncomfortable. For longer sentences, Daniel Defoe's 3 days, for instance, it became genuinely painful as muscles cramped and circulation diminished. But the physical discomfort was the least of it. According to Defoe's own account, in his Hymn to the Pillory, written shortly before his punishment, the true torment came from the crowd. "Tell them the men that placed him here are scandals to the times," he wrote, recognizing that his reputation would be determined not by his actions, but by how the crowd responded to his punishment. The crowd's behavior followed predictable patterns documented in numerous accounts. According to V.A.C. Gatrell in The Hanging Tree, Execution, and the English People, 1770 to 1868, published in 1994, crowds at public punishments operated on a kind of collective moral judgment. Popular criminals, those whose crimes resonated with public sympathies, might face mockery but not violence. Unpopular criminals faced something far worse. Rotten vegetables were traditional. Overripe fruit, spoiled eggs, dead rats, and chamber pot contents, anything malodorous and degrading. Court records occasionally mention crowds preparing materials in advance, suggesting premeditation in what might seem like spontaneous mob action. The goal wasn't to cause serious physical harm. It was to make the experience as humiliating as possible, to mark the criminal not just legally, but socially. Some accounts describe worse. Stones thrown despite official prohibitions, beatings that crossed the line from punishment into assault. Deaths occasionally resulted when crowds became violent, though authorities generally tried to prevent this. A dead criminal served no deterrent purpose. The point was prolonged shame, not quick elimination. But the psychological dimension went deeper than crowd hostility. According to sociologist Irving Goffman in Stigma, Notes on the Management of Spoiled Identity, published in 1963, public degradation ceremonies work by stripping away the social identity that normally protects individuals. The pillory literally lowered the condemned to the level where passers-by looked down on them, physically and symbolically. Children could mock you. Servants could throw refuse at you. People you'd known your entire life would see you helpless, dirty, degraded. For people whose identity came primarily from community standing and reputation, this public destruction of social self was devastating. You didn't just serve time in the pillory. You were transformed by it, marked permanently in the community's memory as the baker who was pilloried, the woman who stood at Charing Cross. This explains why some condemned individuals, facing pillory sentences, chose to flee instead. Court records document numerous cases of people disappearing before punishment could be carried out, abandoning homes, businesses, families, rather than endure public shame. For them, exile was preferable to humiliation in front of everyone they knew. Yet, the pillory's effectiveness depended entirely on the crowd's cooperation. And as Daniel Defoe's experience demonstrated, crowds didn't always comply with official expectations. Daniel Defoe wasn't the only condemned criminal to transform the pillory from punishment into platform. The device's reliance on public participation created vulnerabilities that clever or popular criminals could exploit. In 1777, a case documented in the Proceedings of the Old Bailey, a man named John Fielding stood pilloried for seditious libel, writing political pamphlets criticizing the government. Rather than mockery, he received cheers. Supporters distributed copies of his writings to the crowd. Someone organized a collection that raised more money than his fine. The punishment intended to silence dissent instead amplified it. This happened often enough that authorities recognized the problem. According to Peter Linebaugh in The London Hanged, Crime and Civil Society in the 18th Century, published in 1991 by the late 1700s, where London authorities had begun stationing guards around the pillory to prevent crowds from turning punishment into celebration. But guards couldn't control crowd sentiment. They could prevent violence, but they couldn't manufacture shame. The pillory's effectiveness depended on community consensus about what behaviors deserved punishment. When that consensus broke down, when the condemned was more popular than the authority imposing punishment, the device failed completely. Worse than failure, it created martyrs and heroes. Religious dissidents particularly benefited from this dynamic. During periods of religious persecution in 16th and 17th century England, Puritans, Catholics, and various sectarians faced pillory sentences for their beliefs. But in communities sympathetic to their cause, these punishments backfired spectacularly. William Prynne, a Puritan lawyer, stood in the pillory in 1634 for writing a book criticizing theatre and, by implication, the court's love of theatrical performances. His ears were cut off as additional punishment. 3 years later, for writing more pamphlets, he was pilloried again, and the stumps of his ears were cut even shorter. Each punishment increased his status as a martyr. When civil war came and Puritans gained power, Prynne was celebrated as a hero of resistance. These failures reveal an important truth about public punishment. It only works when the public agrees. The pillory wasn't a state apparatus imposing order on resistant populations. It was a mechanism through which communities enforced their own values. When community values shifted, when sympathy moved from authority to criminal, the pillory became useless or even counterproductive. This dependency on public cooperation also meant the pillory worked differently in different contexts. London crowds, larger and more anonymous than village gatherings, behaved differently. Colonial American pillories, transplanted to societies with different social structures, functioned differently. The device was the same, but its meaning shifted with context. Though the pillory is most documented in English legal history, versions of the device appeared throughout medieval and early modern Europe, each adapted to local legal traditions and social structures. France employed the pillory, often more elaborate than English versions. According to Esther Cohen in The Modulated Scream, Pain in Late Medieval Culture, published in 2009, French pillories sometimes incorporated rotating platforms, forcing the condemned to face different directions so all quarters of the crowd could see them equally. The symbolism was explicit. Justice should be visible from all angles, hiding nothing. German-speaking regions used the Pränge, which appeared in multiple forms. Some resembled English pillories, others were simple posts where criminals were chained by the neck. The Sachsenspiegel, a German legal code from 1220, specified 1 hour in the Pränge for each item stolen, up to a maximum of 3 days, revealing the same careful calibration of shame that characterized English use. The Dutch Schandpaal served similar functions, but often in societies with different commercial structures. Dutch trading cities, more economically advanced than much of medieval Europe, had used the pillory particularly for commercial crimes, fraud, false weights, counterfeiting. The device appeared prominently in market squares, reinforcing its association with commercial trust. Colonial America inherited English pillory traditions, but adapted them to frontier conditions. According to David J. Rothman in The Discovery of the Asylum, Social Order and Disorder in the New Republic, published in 1971, American colonists used the pillory for crimes ranging from drunkenness to blasphemy to sexual offenses. But in smaller colonial settlements, where everyone knew everyone else, the pillory's shaming function worked even more powerfully than in European cities. A case from colonial Boston in 1712, documented in Massachusetts court records, describes a woman pilloried for fornication, sexual relations outside marriage. In a community of a few thousand people, where religious authorities held immense social power, this public shaming didn't just humiliate the individual. It marked her family, affected her children, and followed her for life. The physical punishment was brief, but the social consequences were permanent. Yet American use also revealed the pillory's limitations in pluralistic societies. When Quakers were pilloried in Puritan Massachusetts for their religious beliefs, their co-religionists treated them as martyrs. When enslaved people were pilloried in southern colonies for resistance or escape attempts, the punishment reinforced systems of oppression that increasing numbers of people were beginning to question. These regional variations demonstrate that the pillory wasn't a universal instrument with fixed meaning. It was a flexible tool that each society adapted to its particular needs, values, and social structures. But across all these variations, one pattern remained constant. The pillory worked through visibility, through shame, through community participation in the punishment process. By the 18th century, however, the world was changing in ways that would make the pillory obsolete. In 1764, an Italian philosopher named Cesare Beccaria published a short book that would transform thinking about punishment across Europe and America. On Crimes and Punishments, argued that justice should be swift, certain, proportionate, and most importantly, designed to prevent future crime, rather than simply inflict suffering on criminals. Beccaria's work, translated into English, French, and German within years of publication, and challenged the entire logic of public shaming punishments. According to Beccaria, as translated by legal historian Marcello Maestro, punishment should reform criminals and deter others through rational fear of consequences, not through theatrical humiliation. The pillory failed both tests. It didn't reform anyone. How could public shame teach new behaviors? And its deterrent effect was inconsistent, depending entirely on crowd cooperation. Enlightenment thinkers weren't alone in questioning the pillory. Evangelical religious movements in England and America, particularly Quakers and Methodists, argued that all human beings possessed inherent dignity that public degradation violated. According to Michael Moranzi in Laboratories of Virtue, Punishment, Revolution, and Authority in Philadelphia, 1760 to 1835, published in 1996, Quaker reformers in Pennsylvania led early efforts to abolish public punishments in favor of imprisonment focused on moral reform through isolation and reflection. The argument was partly humanitarian, but also practical. As cities grew larger in the 18th and 19th centuries, public punishments became harder to manage. A crowd of hundreds in a medieval town square was one thing. A crowd of thousands in industrial London or Manchester was something else entirely. Unpredictable, potentially dangerous, and increasingly difficult to control. Intellectual critique combined with practical concerns to create momentum for change. But perhaps the most damaging argument against the pillory came from an unexpected source: medical and scientific authorities who argued that public punishment spread moral contagion. According to this view, and articulated by physicians and social reformers in the late 18th century, gathering crowds to witness degradation taught them to take pleasure in others' suffering. Children brought to see criminals pilloried learned cruelty, not morality. The pillory didn't just punish individuals, it corrupted entire communities by normalizing sadism. Whether this argument was valid is debatable, but it was persuasive to reformers seeking ammunition against traditional punishment methods. By the early 19th century, opposition to the pillory came from religious humanitarians, Enlightenment rationalists, practical administrators dealing with urban crowds, and medical authorities worried about moral health. The pillory also faced competition from a new technology of punishment, the penitentiary, purpose-built prisons, one designed not just to confine but to reform through isolation, labor, and moral instruction, offered an alternative that seemed more modern, more scientific, more humane than public shame. Yet the pillory's disappearance wasn't quick or universal. It faded gradually, used less frequently, restricted to fewer crimes, until finally abolished entirely. The last person pilloried in England stood in the device in 1830, though the punishment wasn't formally abolished until 1837. The final case involved a man convicted of perjury who nearly died when the crowd became violent, throwing stones instead of vegetables. The incident provoked outrage. and Parliament moved quickly to end what was increasingly seen as barbaric and dangerous. But abolition came at different times in different places. Delaware in the United States didn't abolish the pillory until 1905, making it the last American jurisdiction to abandon the practice. According to Scott Christensen in With Liberty for Some, 500 Years of Imprisonment in America, published in 1998, Delaware authorities defended the pillory as cheaper than imprisonment and more effective as deterrent, particularly for commercial crimes. The arguments for retention reveal what supporters valued about the pillory: its economy, its visibility, its communal character. Prison required buildings, guards, ongoing costs. The pillory required only wood and public space. Prison hid criminals away. The pillory made punishment impossible to ignore. Prison was a state function. The pillory was a community ritual. But these arguments lost force as societies changed. Industrial capitalism created different commercial relationships where reputation mattered less and formal regulation more. Growing cities made communal judgment impossible. Who knew their neighbors anymore? Literacy and newspapers created new forms of public shame through print rather than physical display. The pillory was a medieval instrument that didn't fit modern social organization. Yet, its disappearance left traces. The phrase "in the pillory" remains in English to describe public criticism and humiliation. Political scandals are described in terms borrowed from pillory punishment. The assumption that shame should accompany wrongdoing, that justice should be visible, that communities should participate in punishment. These ideas didn't disappear. They merely found new forms. According to James Q. Whitman, in Harsh Justice, Criminal Punishment and the Widening Divide Between America and Europe, published in 2003, American criminal justice retains more shaming elements than European systems, from public perp walks to sex offender registries posted online. The pillory may be gone, but the logic that made it effective, that visible shame deters crime, remains influential in modern punishment debates. The pillory's history also reveals something important about the relationship between punishment and society. The device wasn't imposed on unwilling populations by tyrannical authorities. It emerged from communities' own needs for visible justice, for rituals that reinforced shared values, for mechanisms that allowed everyone to participate in maintaining order. When those needs changed, when shared values fragmented, when modern state capacity made other options available, the pillory became obsolete. Not because it was cruel. Many modern punishments are arguably crueler. Not because it didn't work. It worked quite effectively for centuries. It ended because the world it was designed for no longer existed. The pillory stood in European town squares for over 6 centuries, and its story illuminates fundamental questions about punishment, community, and social control that remain relevant today. First, it demonstrates that punishment is never merely about individual criminals. The pillory was theatre, ritual, education, and warning. It existed to teach lessons, reinforce values, demonstrate power, and mark boundaries. The criminal was important primarily as an object lesson for everyone else. This instrumental use of individual suffering for collective purposes should make us uncomfortable, and should also make us examine whether modern punishment systems escape this same logic or merely hide it better. Second, the pillory reveals the power of shame in maintaining social order. Medieval communities understood that reputation could be more valuable than property, that social death could be worse than physical pain, that the threat of humiliation deterred behavior in ways that the threat of violence could not. Modern societies claim to reject shaming punishments as barbaric, yet we continue to shame through public arrest records, online mugshot databases, sex offender registries, and social media outrage. We've abolished the physical pillory, but retained the logic that made it effective. Third, the pillory's history shows that punishment systems reflect the societies that create them. Medieval communities were small, face-to-face, deeply hierarchical, and religiously unified. The pillory worked because everyone knew everyone, because reputation mattered more than almost anything, because shared values made collective judgment possible. Modern societies are large, anonymous, pluralistic, and fragmented. We can't use the pillory because the social conditions that made it functional no longer exist. Fourth, the pillory's eventual abolition demonstrates that punishment practices aren't eternal or inevitable. What seemed essential to medieval justice became intolerable to 18th century reformers. What seemed barbaric to Enlightenment philosophers had seemed necessary to their ancestors. This historical contingency should make us question whether our current punishment methods are natural or just historically specific responses to particular social conditions. The deeper question is whether the pillory's disappearance represents moral progress. We congratulate ourselves on being more humane than our ancestors, on rejecting public humiliation in favor of dignified incarceration. But is hiding punishment behind prison walls genuinely more humane? Or does it merely make cruelty easier to ignore? The medieval criminal stood in the pillory for hours or days, then returned to community life. The modern prisoner disappears for years or decades, cut off from family, work, and social connection. Perhaps the pillory was more honest about what punishment is: a public assertion of power, a ritual demonstration of values, or a communal act of boundary maintenance. Modern imprisonment claims to be about rehabilitation, public safety, and individual reform. Yet imprisonment rates, recidivism statistics, and the documented harms of incarceration suggest these claims are partly mythological. Perhaps we've merely traded visible cruelty for hidden cruelty, theatrical shame for bureaucratic destruction. The pillory's story doesn't provide easy answers about how societies should respond to crime. But it does reveal that punishment is always about more than individual criminals. It's about what kind of society we want to be, what values we want to reinforce, how we define membership in community, and whether we believe people who transgress can ever truly return. Medieval societies answered these questions through visible, communal, temporary punishment that marked criminals but allowed their eventual reintegration. We've chosen invisible, institutional, extended punishment that separates criminals from society and often ensures they can never fully return. Neither approach is obviously superior. Each reflects different assumptions about community, identity, and the purposes of justice itself. In our next documentary, we'll travel to ancient Athens, where citizens possessed an unprecedented power: the ability to exile anyone, for any reason, simply by voting. Ostracism was democracy's most unusual punishment, and its story reveals both the brilliance and the danger of placing ultimate authority in the hands of the people. How did this system work? What does it tell us about democratic power? And why did Athens eventually abandon it? The answers illuminate democracy itself. If exploring how past societies understood justice interests you, Historical Justice releases similar documentaries every Tuesday and Saturday. Subscribe to continue this examination of how civilizations have addressed crime, punishment, and social order across the centuries. Thank you for watching Historical Justice.